Well, thank you so much, and thank you for ending the day with me. I realize I'm your last speaker before drinks, so I appreciate it. Looking forward to the next 20 minutes together after what has been a really fantastic day. As Greg mentioned, I am Ellen Moeller, and I lead the European business for Watershed. And we are a company that builds tools to help businesses decarbonize. And Greg stole my thunder a little bit here, but I'll say that Watershed was founded in late 2019, and the goal was to help reduce or remove the 500 megatons CO2 equivalent of carbon every year, or about the equivalent of 1% of the world's emissions. And we focus on doing this via businesses by helping businesses decarbonize. Now, we're lucky enough to work with some of the world's most prodigious businesses across a multitude of sectors. And in all these cases, these businesses are, they're going to be a little different in the way that they decarbonize, but the way that we will work with them is that we help them deeply understand through our software and our tooling the emissions in their business and create a credible path to decarbonize those emissions. But maybe taking a little bit of a step back on kind of how we got started and why we're here, it's worth taking a relook, probably for the final time today, of a chart you've probably seen a few different versions of throughout the various presentations. No surprise to people in this room, but currently we are on track to increase our emissions globally to a really untenable amount. And what that means is potentially catastrophic climate effects. They're going to affect every business and every person in the world. What we need to do is decrease our emissions and limit them to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we have a big task ahead of us to do that. If you look at this chart, you'll see a different version. I'm sure you've seen a few versions of this I mentioned, but this kind of light blue chart going to the top right, that's the path we're on today. That dark blue is what we need to do, and it's a pretty steep curve. And to put that in practical terms, what that means is we need to reduce emissions by 50 gigatons by 2050. And we need to be halfway there by 2030. That is a big task, and a task that we are not on track to do. And this is a critical decade to do it. And then after that, we have a series of another 2 decades in order to hit that mark. Now, if any of you saw the recent UN report, you'll know that that path to 1.5 degrees Celsius is looking more and more uncertain. And that just means we need to be redoubling the efforts that we're putting in place today. And there are 2 key levers that we have to reduce those emissions. One, of course, is reductions. It is reducing emissions within supply chains, within business practices, within agricultural use. And it's also removing carbon from the atmosphere. There is going to be carbon that we are not able to reduce, and we need to scale technologies that today are not scaled in order to remove that excess carbon. What this looks like is reducing from about 50 to 10 gigatons of carbon from a reduction standpoint, and then scaling those technologies to help us remove that extra 10 gigatons. It is truly going to be the challenge of our generation and of our lifetimes. Now, I started off by saying Watershed works with businesses, and you may be wondering what businesses have to do with this. There are going to be a lot of different players that are going to be critical to making that curve happen, to bending that curve, as we like to say at Watershed. And the public sector is going to be very critical to that, but the private sector is also going to be hugely critical. Listed companies alone make up about 40% of climate warming emissions. And so they're going to have a huge impact in how we're able to actually bend that curve. And that's where we play a role with our businesses today. To impact emissions, there's a couple components of where a business needs to be thinking about how they can actually have impact. The first, of course, is deeply understanding what their impact looks like. What do their emissions look like, and what levers do they have at their disposal to reduce, and then setting a plan to actually enact those reductions. It's not just about targets, it's about truly acting. The second is the role that businesses can play in creating demand for that technology that needs to scale to help us hit that 2050 target, namely carbon removal. And then finally, investing. And this is where the financial sector plays a key role in helping invest to decarbonize the rest of the economy. And there was a great talk earlier today from Just Climate that gave a lot of detail on exactly what needs to happen here. Let's take each of those in turn. Let's focus for a minute on reductions. and what businesses can do across reducing their emissions. Now, there's going to be a lot of different levers. I mentioned at the beginning, every business has a little bit of a different lever, but they kind of boil down to these three buckets. The first is electrification and clean energy, and this is doing things like getting clean energy for data centers or electrifying fleets or electrifying buildings onto renewables. The second is land use efficiency. So how are you actually using land, either directly or within your supply chain, changing to agricultural practices that are less carbon intensive. And finally, for most businesses, a lot of their power is going to come in how they spend their money, what their scope 3 emissions look like, where they're actually engaging with suppliers and have the ability to affect climate change that way, or even buying less intensive carbon options where that option exists or where they're a product-led business. So let's take a moment to look through each of these in sort of practical examples and how we've seen these come to life with some of our Watershed customers. The first is a company called DoorDash. Now, DoorDash is a food delivery company that operates in a number of different geographies. And DoorDash worked with Watershed to understand the data of their business to identify the hotspots where their emissions lie. And perhaps not surprisingly, one of the big areas of emissions was actually the logistics component, sort of how the food was getting from the restaurant to your front door. And for DoorDash, what they identified is there was obviously a huge discrepancy based on factors of mileage and on what kind of vehicle or mode of transportation was used to get that food to your door. For example, combustion engines, a car with a combustion engine was about 3 times more intensive than an electric vehicle. An electric vehicle was 23 times more intensive than using a bike. And so they did a massive exercise to relook across all of their business and have now started on a track to kind of reduce those emissions by electrifying fleets and focusing on electric fleets where it's possible and optimizing for bikes where they can, ultimately reducing those emissions. Sweetgreen, another example. This is one that focuses more on that kind of second bucket, that land use, as well as on supplier engagement. Sweetgreen is a healthy food chain that primarily operates across the United States. And Sweetgreen worked with Watershed to deeply understand the emissions of every item on their menu, every item that would end up in their restaurants. And what they did through that is they identified hotspots. They figured out kind of where the intensity of the emissions really lie. And for Sweetgreen, perhaps not surprisingly, if you've ever kind of gone in and created a salad, you'll imagine that the emissions were concentrated primarily in dairy and in meat. And by engaging with their suppliers as a next step from that, they were able to determine that depending on the methane practices, they could actually reduce the emissions of their cheese that they were using in their restaurants by about 50%. And they did make that change and reduce those emissions for the dairy products. In the same turn, they were able to actually reduce the emissions for their meat products by switching from beef meatballs to turkey and mushroom meatballs. And actually, excitingly from there, Sweetgreen went even further, and they actually created low-carbon menus that they marketed to consumers as low-carbon. And so the whole project had a really interesting return on investment for them and actually a way to engage with their consumer base. Now, final example on reductions, let's take Kainos. Now, Kainos, unlike DoorDash, doesn't have a fleet. They're not sort of heavy in logistics. They aren't necessarily sourcing things from farms. They're not using a lot of land. They're really an IT company. They're a technology company with a consulting layer as well. And for Kainos, the path looked a little different. For them, they kind of took the first steps of really thinking about electrification, and they're now well on their way to 100% renewables across their offices here in London and in Belfast, where they're headquartered, as well as across Europe and North America. And they've also been deeply engaging with their suppliers. This has been a really key lever for them because a lot of their emissions actually lie in the way they spend their money, in the suppliers and the vendors that they use. And so they've been working with Watershed to understand the emissions of those suppliers, to prioritize those where they can have meaningful influence, and even get some of them on track to setting their own reduction paths. Now, we've talked about the reduction element. We've talked about that as a kind of key lever. I want to focus also for a moment on carbon removal and where businesses can play a role here. So what you're seeing here is a bit of a kind of picture of the landscape for the carbon removal market. On one side, you of course have the supply side. These are all the projects. And on the demand side, you have the companies, the governments, the consumers who will purchase from those projects. And carbon removal is having the sort of same challenge as a lot of new technology. It's not scaled enough to be cost effective and cheap enough for the demand side. And what we need to see happen with carbon removal is a lot of investment to kind of bring that inflection and change that curve on the cost of carbon removal. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need 10 gigatons of carbon removal. We have a huge way to go in terms of scaling that. And so we need to see carbon removal take the same path as microchips and computers, which at one point were very expensive and now are everywhere in all of our phones and in our homes. And even as solar more recently, that started off as being very expensive and now is much, much more cost effective. This is the type of path that we need to see happen for carbon removal, and businesses can play a really key role here in investing in carbon removal technologies. This is another area that Watershed works with our customers. We have a marketplace, in addition to the work we do on measurement and on reductions with our customers. We have a marketplace that provides access to the carbon removal markets. And we worked with customers like Square. So Square is a technology company, a fintech company. And we first worked with them actually on reductions and on setting a path. We helped them kind of figure out which plastic changes they could make to actually reduce the amount of plastic in card readers. We helped them think through electrification. And then they actually have been working with us specifically on pulling together a portfolio of carbon removal. Like many other tech companies, they really want to kind of use their capital for good and focus on investing in places where they know we need scale. And so they've worked with us on pulling together a portfolio, which is now on track to remove around 27,000 tons of carbon. Similarly, actually, DoorDash, who I mentioned earlier, has also been investing here. And they actually used carbon removal as a way to engage with their customers during their pilot launch in Germany in 2021. In an effort to make their deliveries net zero, they actually gave the option for their customers to be able to choose carbon removal projects directly in the app that they could then contribute to as part of that delivery. So we've talked about reductions, we've talked about carbon removal. The kind of final place where the private sector is going to play a really critical role is going to be on investment. Private investment is a critical lever for decarbonization. And if you talk to kind of any climate economists out there, they're going to tell you that we're going to need about 90 trillion for global decarbonization. That is a very big number. And a lot of it will come from the public sector, but not all of it will. And the private sector is going to be immensely critical to ensuring global decarbonization. Private capital is going to be important to close that gap, whether that's investing in new technologies and helping them off the ground, some of the talk from earlier today from Just Climate, but also engaging with portfolios and the companies already invested in by the private sector and helping them get on that path. Now, this is not just important because of return on investment, but it's also critical for risk mitigation. We talked earlier about that 1.5 degrees Celsius number. Even with that, we're going to see very material climate effects. But if we go well above that, which is what we're on track to do, that is going to massively be a disruptor for so many businesses. If you think about the impacts on supply chain, on sea level rises, on crop seasons, there's a huge impact and a huge risk that comes with us not doing something about this. And the private sector and investors in particular have a huge amount of influence to be able to get companies thinking about this sooner. So just to kind of start to wrap us up here, the potential value and opportunity costs from acting on climate has never been greater for businesses. It obviously comes with some risk, but it also comes with some opportunity. And we see this every day through the businesses that we work with. On the financial side, it actually can have some very meaningful operational efficiencies for a lot of businesses. Think about actually reducing your logistics footprint. That actually can have meaningful financial reduction benefits as well. It can also be a competitive advantage. A lot of companies out there are now really trying to optimize for only working with suppliers who have a meaningful, credible path to decarbonization or have set science-based targets. And so getting on this journey early can also set you up for the types of customers that you want to work with. Or if you're a consumer-facing business, as we're seeing consumers engage and care about this more and more. It also can create access to more pools of capital, especially as investors, per the previous slide, are thinking about this more and more. And then, of course, there is mounting external pressure, and especially for us here in the UK and across Europe, there is going to be regulatory pressure coming into effect that is going to affect many, many businesses, even smaller businesses than are affected today in terms of the disclosures and the requirements to invest in a sustainable strategy. So just in summary, businesses obviously have a huge role to play in bending the carbon curve. And at Watershed, we not only see the climate urgency, but also the business opportunity for the many businesses that we work with. We help them measure, we help them deeply understand their emissions and what they can actually do about that, focusing on the data. We also help them act by acting on those reductions and on accessing the carbon removal markets. And importantly, we also help them be transparent about where they are in that journey. So reporting on that publicly, being clear on how they get the data that they do, and where they are as they look to decarbonize. And we also know that the collective effort is what really makes a difference. And so the more companies that we can get on this journey, the better. Thank you, and happy to take questions, Greg.